So at the McGill Center for Studies in Aging, we are looking at what are the factors and what are the causes that contribute to aging, and is there anything we can do about this? And I don't think that is something that is new. In fact, if you look through art and through history, you'll find that many people have been fascinated by this topic over the centuries. This is a painting that perhaps some of you recognize by Lucas Cranach the Elder, the Fountain of Youth. And in his imagination, you would simply step in, old, frail, and diseased on the left side, take a rejuvenating wash, and then emerge from the waters on the right, young, healthy, and strong again. Now, it's not quite as easy. If you find that fountain, do let me know. I'd like to take a bath myself. But I think it illustrates two key points that are associated with aging. One is this very high motivation to identify factors that can slow down or even stop the process of aging. And then secondly, the idea that aging is associated with disease, frailty, and sickness, whereas youth typically is associated with beauty, strength, and power. Now, looking at these two different aspects of aging and asking ourselves, is there something that we can do either about the process of aging or the associated disease? We have to differentiate the picture. The process of aging is probably something that we cannot do anything about. It's deeply embedded into our organism, and it's an essential part of life. And it's probably a very important part of life because it allows the change of our species through generations so that we can adapt to the changing environmental demands. So the survival of the species comes at the cost of the death of the individual. But that is basically one of the main aspects or main reasons for why we age. On the other hand, the age-associated disease, why we get ill with age, that clearly is something that we might be able to do something about. And both of these aspects, the age-related disease and the aging itself, now have to do with something called the telomeres, which are seemingly nonsense DNA sequences at the end of our chromosomes in the core of every cell. And when researchers first came across these telomeres, they realized that even though they don't seem to serve any purpose, there's a consistent decline of these telomeres with aging. So the older we get, the less we have. And then looking more closely into this, researchers could show that every time a cell divides, every time we duplicate our DNA information, a little bit of this telomere gets chopped off, so that it's kind of like an internal clock inside our cell, and when it's used up, the cell can no longer divide and then is prone to senescence and dying. So this seems to be the mechanism by which every cell has a certain lifespan, and once it's used up, that cell has to die and eventually the organism has to die. But what you can see here from this picture as well is that there seems to be significant variation. So it's not as linear as this cell division would make it sound. There seem to be other factors that can contribute to an accelerated aging, contribute to these telomeres getting shorter sooner than they should be, sooner than what would be necessary. And that is, of course, a question where researchers then became very interested in to see what are those factors that might contribute to this accelerated aging, and what are the reasons can we identify and modify these factors. And among the different factors that have been identified, one of them have been environmental factors. And among the environmental factors, one of the important ones that stand out is stress. Now, what is stress? Stress is basically an increased demand on the individual brought by a change in the environment. And we typically react to it by engaging a cascade of systems in our body that will allow you to energize, to mobilize energy, to better cope with this increase in demand. There are physiological systems, adrenaline, noradrenaline, the fight-flight response that you I'm sure have heard of. And there are endocrine systems. This is where the psychoneuroendocrinology comes in, with the end product cortisol, a hormone that is released from the adrenal cortex that also serves to provide energy. Now, importantly, the cortisol has been directly related to the shortening of your telomeres, the repeat DNA sequence that can lead to accelerated aging. because even though it mobilizes energy and helps you to cope with the increased demand in the short term, it can lead to an impaired maintenance of these telomeres and thus lead to accelerated aging in the long term. And depending on where this happens, you then might develop a disease, an illness, a chronic disease that then can affect you. Now, where does the sex and gender come in? Where does the Women's Brain Health Initiative come in? Let's take a look at what chronic illness looks like in men and women across the lifespan. So I tried to make this politically correct by giving the girls the pink and the boys the blue. And what you see here is basically the age across the lifespan, optimistically going above 100 years, and then the percent of the population that is suffering from chronic illness, just comparing women to men. And you see we start off pretty even, 50 to 50, 1-to-1 ratio, and then it hovers around that 50 to 50 until about midlife. And there's even slightly less chronic illness in women and slightly higher chronic illness in men. There are many different factors that contribute to that. Lifestyle, an important one. As much as men are not asking for directions, they also don't seek medical help when they have ailments, and that contributes to a greater ratio of chronic illness early in life, as well as engaging in more risky health behaviors and higher rates of substance use also leads to higher rates of chronic illness in men in the first 5 life decades. However, you see that starting around 50, there seems to be a consistent negative slope that occurs, and this ratio now shifts towards favoring the man and imbalancing the women. So by the time that you reach old adulthood, you will find for every man that is suffering from a chronic illness, 2 women that suffer from a chronic illness. And the question is, what's happening in the second part of your life that now this becomes so imbalanced? And I'll try to give you a couple of ideas. But before we get there, this imbalance becomes even more pronounced, dramatically so, when you look at brain disease, and specifically Alzheimer, which is the leading cause or the leading neurodegenerative disease in men. And some researchers believe that at the peak of this disease, you will find 5 women suffering from Alzheimer's disease for every man. So an even greater imbalance between men and women for Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Now, stress might have a direct relation to this imbalance and to this increase in chronic illness in women in the later parts of their life. First evidence comes from the fact that the areas that are first affected by dementia, and these lie in the medial temporal lobe, and are structures called the hippocampus and the parahippocampal gyrus, structures that are mostly associated with memory formation and learning, are also the one that are most affected by stress. And this is a 3D picture where we identified the areas that seem to be affected by stress using functional magnetic resonance imaging in our lab. And the most pronounced areas are exactly these areas in the medial temporal lobes that are known to show the greatest atrophy in dementia. So there's a link where stress seems to affect those areas that get affected the most in dementia. There's further evidence, and this is a research by Robert Sapolsky from Stanford University, that just looked at the exposure to this stress hormone cortisol, the end product of what happens when you're under stress, and the occurrence of several different diseases in context of hippocampal volume reduction. So all of these different disease states, depression, Cushing syndrome, and endocrinological disorder and combat stress, have in common that they are associated with great amounts of cortisol being released. And the longer this excessive cortisol release went on, the more the hippocampus in these affected subjects then declined. And shrinkage of the hippocampus is one diagnostic factor for occurrence of dementia. So another direct link that stress might have a direct cause, be a direct causal factor for the occurrence of dementia. So then you could ask now, how come that women are more affected now, right? So why is it that this ratio of chronic illness and especially dementia now tips in favor of the man in the second part of their life? First, we have to state that women are responding more strongly to a particular type of stress, and that is social stress. And this has been shown here in a study by my former supervisor, Clemens Kirschbaum, way back in the 90s, where he exposed men and women to a standardized laboratory stressor. But he imposed different conditions under which they were exposed to this stressor. They either had to do this stressful task in isolation, or they could have a stranger present, or they could have their partner present. And where men showed the initial greater response when exposed to this standardized stressor, they actually became less stressed when a stranger was around and least stressed when their female partner was around. Whereas the women, when they were exposed in isolation, were doing quite well to begin with, but they got really worse when their male partner was around. So having your male partner around is not helpful when you are in stress, whereas being male and having your female partner around is indeed very helpful. And that is quite interesting, and you can wonder why this is, but and I'll welcome a discussion later. I don't have the answer, actually. But you can first state that indeed women seem to respond more strongly to a stressor. Now, this might be not so bad for the first part of your life, because these effects of stress and the stress hormone cortisol that seems to be damaging to the brain are buffered by another hormone that you have circulating in your system, estrogen. And this is yet another study by my former supervisor, where now as line graph you see what happens to the levels of cortisol that are circulating in your system after you've been exposed to a standardized stressor. And you see that here the men are actually showing the highest level of response, and then the women, depending on the amount of estrogen that is present in their system, will show differentially lower and lower responses. So women in the luteal phase who have moderately low levels of estrogen are close to the men. Women in the follicular phase who have high levels of estrogen are significantly lower. And women using estrogen-containing oral contraceptives, which gives you the highest artificial levels of estrogen, now actually rank at the bottom of this scale. So the cortisol that might be damaging can actually do any harm because the estrogen is buffering the effects from it. But of course, that is only true as long as you have estrogen in your system. And here comes the explanation for why we see this shift after 50 years of age, because that's typically when women enter menopause. So both men and women actually have amounts of estrogen, because estrogens are not only produced by the ovaries in the women, but also by the adrenal cortex, and that is present in both men and women. But this imbalance towards women having more estrogen is only true until menopause, and then after menopause you can actually show that men have more estrogen than women, because men continue to produce estrogen through their steroid-producing glands, whereas women, once they no longer ovulate, have no more estrogen production, period. This could, in fact, explain the differential risk of suffering from dementia that has also been proposed in the literature. And this is a study by Zandi in the Journal of the American Medical Association, already published in 2002, who suggests that depending on the duration of hormone replacement therapy supplementing estrogen after menopause, the risk of suffering from dementia actually can be brought down to be on par with that of men, right? So all of this, a powerful argument to say, well, estrogen should be very good. However, you might remember that there has been quite a controversy surrounding the use of hormone replacement therapy and estrogen. And after a study was published in 2002 by the World Health Organization that showed that there's an increased risk of breast cancer, blood clots in the veins, and bladder infection the recommendation to use hormone replacement therapy was stopped by the World Health Organization, and the frequency of hormone replacement therapy has plummeted since dramatically, which makes you then question whether it's well, what is the net risk or the net effect of having one or the other. Bluntly stated, would you rather have breast cancer or would you rather have dementia, right? Is it one or the other? And that is, of course, something where I think further research is necessary. This original recommendation has been revisited since in numerous articles, and there are a couple of comments to be made. One is that the original studies that came to the recommendation all looked at women using a particular form of estrogen therapy, which was derived from horse hormones. And there's a question of whether that actually might have contributed to the negative effects. Secondly, the dosage and the combination is of question, and you see here already that whether you use estrogen or estrogen and progestin does have a significant effect on some of the outcome variables. And then certainly the amount and the frequency by which you use it also seem to play a role. Estrogen buffers the damaging effects from cortisol, but at the same time it's a growth factor, and this growth factor might be what contributes to the increased risk of breast cancer. So the more you are able to mimic the natural occurring menstrual cycle by giving a dosed hormone replacement therapy, the more you might be able to avoid any of the negative effects and then just gain the beneficial effects. And I think this is where research is currently heading for, to revisit this and then see whether one can come up with a somewhat accentuated recommendation. What is not really in question are the beneficial effects of estrogen that you find in the brain. And this has been replicated numerous times and has been contributed by different research groups and labs. We have also contributed to this literature by showing that the hippocampal volumes, the integrity of this key structure that is affected by dementia and associated with learning and memory, is larger in postmenopausal women who use estrogen therapy as compared to past users, never users, and men. If you look here, the volume of the hippocampus for the estrogen users compared to women that never used, women that used in the past, or men, is significantly different, suggesting that estrogen really contributes to the preservation of this structure with age. And here we can really state that the more the better. If you have more hippocampus as you grow old, you will have a more intact memory and more intact capacity for new learning. And this is also complemented by studies showing the cognitive effects, the cognitive beneficial effects of estrogen therapy. Here exemplarily shown by a study from Barbara Sherwin from McGill University, who could show that people that are using estrogen have a post-treatment increase in key cognitive functions that is not present in the women that took placebo and were not receiving any of the estrogen. So this leaves us at a picture where we could now state that estrogen clearly does seem to have beneficial effects, especially in the brain. Mechanisms that might be mediated by buffering the adverse effects of the stress hormone cortisol that seems to be neurotoxic and damaging, and that stress is a potential mechanism to cause age-related disease by affecting the maintenance of these telomeres, the tips of your chromosomes that when used up prevent the cell from further dividing. Women seem to be more stress reactive. However, they are buffered from these adverse effects of stress by the presence of estrogen until menopause, and then the hormonal changes that naturally occur with menopause might then make women more prone to develop disease unless you come in and try to supplement the estrogen to prevent the full brunt of the cortisol to have adverse effects in the brain and the periphery. And with that, I'll thank you very much. And I'll open the floor for any questions you might have.